How you can go from Shakespeare to that meaningless babble is beyond me. I made no answer, because I was actually worried about the leopard. It was clawing at Bacchus, who had taken firm hold on the pine cone, and he looked mad enough to yank it free forcibly, tearing the fur out in the process. So while they were still in sight, I changed the binding. I loosed the knots to the leopard, and instead bound the pine cone between the eyes of Bacchus himself. He could tear off his own skin if he wanted. His barbaric yelp shook our windows as we disappeared from sight, zipping down the on-ramp to US 60.
"Is that it, then?"
Gunnar asked.
"Did we lose him?"
"Not for good," I said. "He's probably sharp enough to know where we're headed. He's dealt with Druids before. He can fly in a straight line and shave a lot of time off his trip." "So what I'm hearing you say," Leaf said, already weaving past human motorists at dangerous speeds, "is that I should go a bit faster." "Right. But with the proviso that we need to remain alive and uninjured at the end of the journey." We tried to relax as we drove out to Superior and then took Highway 177 south toward a small town called Winkleman. When one is being pursued by a god, it's extremely difficult to pretend that nothing is amiss. But we tried, because machismo demanded it. We spoke of other things, as if we were out cruising instead of fleeing. Leaf amused us with what he'd accomplished last night at the stadium, spending a large part of the drive giving us a play-by-play account of how he'd dismantled 63 vampires. "The key to sowing mayhem in the age of electronics is to deprive humans of electricity," he began. "I took out not only the transformer for the city block, but the backup generators within the stadium as well. That meant the security cameras were out of it, and only dim flashes of movement would ever be seen by human eyes. Their cell phone cameras work poorly in low light. I was thus free to travel throughout the stadium and hunt the Memphis nest at my leisure. They had foolishly spread themselves throughout the crowd rather than concentrate their strength in an unassailable position." He grinned wickedly in the rearview mirror. "The young and naive fell to the hand of experience and guile." "The papers didn't say anything about irregularities with the bodies, but they probably didn't discover them until today sometime," I said. "I'm sure tomorrow's headlines will be engrossing. It's on the internet already, I'm sure. Aren't you worried that the existence of vampires will be exposed to the public?" Leaf shrugged. "My own existence remains a secret. I will worry about it when and if I return."
"When?"
Gunnar emphasized.
"Not if."
"Come on, Leaf," I persisted. "One or more of those vampire bodies are going to get kissed by the sun and go up in flames. That's going to be a big fucking clue, and even a semi-competent coroner is going to figure out that those bodies died a long time before last night. Admit it, you just made vampires real." "I admit no such thing. They will blame fires on undetected flammable gases or fluids, and the coroner who suggests that those bodies are vampires or anything close to undeath will lose his job. Whatever they figure out will either be squashed or disbelieved by a public raised on a diet of science and skepticism." I shook my head. "You must have a giant pair of hairy balls," I said, then added, "Unless you don't. Say, Leaf, do vampires have balls?" Gunnar tried and failed to stifle a laugh. "Atticus?" Leaf said. "Yes, Leaf? You have my permission to fuck off." Pretending I had never spoken, he proceeded to flesh out his hunting story, culminating in the dismemberment of the Memphis Nest leader. From Winkleman we headed south on State Route 77 and picked up a police officer anxious to pull over a speeding muscle car. Leaf eased up on the accelerator and let Gunnar hold the wheel steady. He rolled down his window and leaned out, facing the rear. His gaze captured the officer's eyes and charmed him. Shortly thereafter, the sirens ceased their wailing, and the police officer pulled himself over. Leaf pulled his head back into the car and spent a few vain moments straightening his wind-blown hair in the mirror, while Gunnar continued to steer from the passenger seat. I sniggered. "You have something to say to me, Mr. O'Sullivan?" Leaf asked archly. "Please do not trouble yourself about your appearance, Mr. Helgerson," I replied. "I assure you that you look very pretty." Gunnar chuckled, and Leaf raised his chin haughtily. "I shall ignore the jealous jibes of ugly men," he announced.
"He's talking about you, Atticus,"
Gunnar said. "Your mom talked about me," I said, and the werewolf abruptly lost his sense of humor and growled. I smiled and kept silent after that, as did Leaf. You can push a werewolf only so far. We turned left on Aravaipa Road and continued for 12 miles, the last 8 of which were covered in gravel. The Aravaipa Canyon Wilderness is not technically a forest, nor does it contain much in the way of oak, ash, or thorn, but its healthy riparian habitat is strong enough to support a tether to Tir na Nog. More than 200 species of birds, 9 species of bats, and fish species native to Arizona live there, along with black bears, bobcats, desert bighorn sheep, and coatis. The trees are largely broadleaf species, a pleasing mixture of alder, willow, walnut, cottonwood, and sycamore, all lining the perennial flow of Aravaipa Creek. There are true forests with stronger ties to Tir na Nog, slightly closer to Tempe as the crow flies, but in terms of getting the hell out of town quickly, this was my best option. The 3 of us climbed out of the Mustang, and Leaf left the keys in the ignition. I enhanced my vision for night and slipped off my sandals, carrying them in my left hand. The entrance to the wilderness was fenced off, but we vaulted it and began to jog toward the creek. The tabletop mesas on either side of the canyon held little in the way of wildlife. It was the bottom of the canyon that was rich in that regard.
How far on foot?
Gunnar asked. About a mile in. We should be okay to shift, I said. Keep a sharp ear out for pursuit, will you? My senses couldn't begin to approach theirs while in human form. I still don't think Bacchus gave up on us. We loped easily through the night, and I spoke to Sonora as I ran, informing him, or her as Granuaile insisted, that I hoped to return soon. Gunnar looked over his shoulder with about a half-mile to go, and Leaf did the same a second later.
He's coming,
Gunnar said. No more jogging, I said. Leaf, you're the fastest on 2 legs. Can you carry us?
I don't know where we're going,
he protested. Straight down the canyon. I'll tell you when to stop. Then you guys just throw rocks at him or something. Keep him off us until I can shift us away. Gunnar didn't like the idea of being carried, but he saw the necessity. We weren't going to stay ahead of flying leopards for very long. Leaf picked us up easily in a fireman's carry over either shoulder, and then he lit out with his best speed. It reminded me of the violent ride on top of Ratatosk. Still, the vampire's best speed was short of a leopard's. We heard a roar behind us, and then a victorious "Ha!" from Bacchus. Immediately afterward, Leaf dropped out from under us, and I went flying through the air, along with Gunnar, to land painfully against the trunk of a cottonwood. I scrambled to my feet and saw that Leaf's legs were tangled in ivy, or perhaps grapevines. Bacchus was catching up and swooping down at us, his face a mask of the sort of frenzy he inspired. Well, sanity was better than madness. I sent a message to Sonora through the earth. Druid needs favor. Prevent rapid plant growth. My location, now. Gratitude. Gunnar was shucking off his shoes and jeans and going wolf. He didn't bother with the rugby shirt, deciding for philanthropic reasons it was best for everyone if it got destroyed in the transformation. Just hamstring the kiddies, I told him while I was waiting for Sonora's answer. Don't mess with the god. Gunnar managed a nod before his face elongated into a snout and his human expression was gone. Favor granted, Sonora replied, and I sent him my thanks. Bacchus touched down and unleashed his leopards with the Latin equivalent of siccum before leaping out of his chariot to follow behind. The leopards sprang at Leaf, who was now disentangled from the vines that had tripped him, but he dodged out of the way with vampiric speed and let them continue on. He stepped forward to confront the god of wine, who was notably bereft of his thyrsus and showing no sign that he'd had a pine cone stuck between his eyes an hour ago, while Gunnar advanced to meet the 2 leopards. Just chuck him back upstream, Leaf. Don't test your strength against his, I shouted as Gunnar and the leopards collided in a mess of fur, claws, and teeth. Bacchus wasn't completely incompetent as a fighter, as evidenced by his stance as Leaf approached, but neither was he used to confronting vampires with 1,000 years of martial arts experience. Leaf jabbed a couple of lightning raps to his jaw to set him back on his heels. Then he spun and dropped the wine god on his ass with a kick to the side of the knees. While Bacchus was still down, Leaf quickly grabbed him by the feet and yanked to deny him leverage for a kick, then spun him around in a discus toss, finally throwing him several hundred yards away up the canyon. He landed heavily in the rocky creek bed and probably broke something. Shame about that. In the meantime, Gunnar had lamed the 2 leopards, but not without taking on significant damage himself. The good news was that he would heal, and the leopards wouldn't be pulling Bacchus along to harry us any time soon. "Nice throw," I said. "Come on, let's go. It's just a little bit farther." I gathered Gunner's jeans and shoes and carried them with my sandals as Leaf scooped me up again to continue down the canyon. Gunner kept pace alongside now that he was in wolf form. "Keep to the creek bed if you can," I requested. Leaf obligingly swerved to take the requested course, which would allow me to keep a sort of jittery surveillance on Bacchus. The Olympian staggered to his feet in a fury and located us easily. He had one hand pressed to a spot on his lower back, but as I watched, he brought both hands around in front of him at waist height and slowly raised them, a clear gesture commanding something to rise from the ground. Vines of some sort, no doubt. Thanks to Sonora's help, nothing happened. Leaf ran unencumbered, and I chuckled. Speaking in a conversational tone, I said in Latin, "Lord Bacchus, can you hear me? Nod if you can hear me." Bacchus dropped his hands and nodded. "You have never killed a druid all by yourself, and you never will. Only with hordes of Bacchans and Roman legionnaires, and the aid of Minerva, have you ever managed to slay a single one of us. Your lackeys may get me eventually, and I know that I will never be able to slay you. But admit to yourself now that you alone will never prove my equal. The earth obeys me, son, not some petty god of grape and goblet." I switched to English for a postscript. "So suck on that, bitch." Bacchus didn't bother to compose an intelligible reply. He merely roared his defiance and came after us. But he wasn't especially fast on his feet. He was no quicker than any mortal man, and he had hundreds of yards to make up. "Find me a nice tree, Leaf, anywhere near here," I said. Leaf immediately steered us out of the creek bed and deposited me at the base of an impressive sycamore. Unlike the Fae, who specifically need oak, ash, and thorn to shift planes, I could use any stand of timber that was sufficiently robust to connect to Tir na Nog. It didn't matter if I used a sycamore or a sequoia. All I needed was a healthy forest. Gunner sat on his haunches next to us, panting and bleeding. "All right. Both of you touch me and the sycamore at the same time." I looked at Gunner to make sure he understood. He responded by rising on his hind legs and placing one huge paw on my chest, the other against the trunk of the tree. I needed skin contact, so I poked a finger of my left hand, the one holding the shoes and jeans, into his fur. Leaf condescendingly put a hand on my head and the other on the tree. I took one last look upstream to check on the wine god's position. He was sprinting somewhat spastically down the creek and not paying enough attention to his footwork. He slipped on a moss-covered rock and looked very mortal as he executed a spectacularly graceless faceplant. I laughed, because I knew he could hear me, and I wanted him to know I'd seen his humiliation. We still had plenty of time to shift. Sensing that I was about to escape, Bacchus looked up from where he lay in the stream bed. "Your insults will be paid in good time," he said in a voice of barely restrained fury. "I swear to Jupiter I will tear you apart myself, Druid. Your death is long overdue." "Perhaps I deserve to die," I admitted. "But you don't deserve to live. Your very existence is nothing but a feeble echo of Dionysus. You are a weak copy of a better god." I gave him no chance to respond, proceeding on the maxim that it's always best to have the last word. I closed my eyes, sought the tether to Tir na Nog, and pulled us through to the land of the Fae.